The United States submitted a proposed resolution to the UN Security Council outlining the future governing bodies and international military force in the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, in Gaza, more bodies of hostages were excavated and returned to Israel over the past week, and the ceasefire between the sides was broadly maintained despite repeated violations. In northern Israel, the arena between Israel and Hezbollah has continued to escalate. Massive IDF airstrikes were reported in southern Lebanon over the past week, while the Lebanese government informed that it will not be able to disarm Hezbollah by force. You're watching the Israel-Palestine Report with Professor Alon Burstein. Hit that subscribe button. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Israel-Palestine Report. Before I get started, I'm going to mention that if you follow this channel, check out the link in the first comment. It'll take you to a newsletter that I am setting up in order to inform people about live streams and other developments in the arena. Feel free to sign up. So, diving in, what has happened this past week in the Gaza Strip? What is the situation of the ceasefire between the sides, and where do things stand with regards to the implementation of the first phase of the deal between the sides? After the deadly week that happened 2 weeks ago in Gaza, over the past week, the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas was largely upheld. That does not mean that there were not repeated violations of the truce between the sides, and almost every day there were reported incidents with the Israeli military carrying out attacks against Palestinians that crossed the yellow demarcation line, that is the line that the Israeli military has withdrawn to in the Gaza Strip, as well as Palestinian operatives attempting to approach and possibly attack Israeli military positions, again throughout the Gaza Strip. Among others, on Sunday, the Israeli military reported an airstrike against an armed Palestinian operative that was approaching Israeli military forces in the areas of Sajaiya in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip over here. And there were also repeated similar incidents throughout the week in Sajaiya as well as in Han Yunis in the southern parts of the Strip. Again, almost every day there were these different incidents. Hours before I recorded this, Palestinian sources reported an Israeli attack that also took place in the Al Bureij region in the central parts of the Gaza Strip, which also reportedly happened near the yellow demarcation line, near the area that the Israeli military is withdrawn to, marking where the Israeli military is and where Hamas is. Now, the reason that I say the ceasefire was largely upheld is that contrary to the previous weeks, where the sides returned to fighting all over Gaza as a result of these more local escalations, all of these incidents in the past week were located solely along that yellow demarcation line where the Israeli military has redeployed and did not escalate beyond the immediate actions. Despite this, it's important to note that over 20 Palestinians were reportedly killed in those different incidents in the Gaza Strip over the past week, which again took place in northern, central, and southern Gaza. And the Israeli military has reported that there are continued attempted violations by Hamas as well. So all this is happening every day in the Gaza Strip, but the sides have not returned to full-on fighting as they did in the previous weeks before they returned to the ceasefire. Alongside this, the three more main developments occurred in Gaza over the past week. First, Hamas has continued to search different bombed-out areas throughout the Gaza Strip in an attempt to locate and excavate the remaining bodies of hostages that are still held in Gaza. Last week, Hamas had informed negotiators that it needs to conduct these searches within the areas that are controlled by the Israeli military, and following major pressure on Israel from the United States, Israel finally agreed to allow Hamas into the areas that are beyond the control zones of the Israeli military, and actually ordered the IDF troops to withdraw from their positions in specific areas in Gaza, while Hamas operatives entered them to carry out the excavations alongside the Red Cross workers. Despite intensive criticism within Israel over the fact that armed Al-Qassam operatives were entering the areas where the Israeli military withdrew from, and a lot of criticism over the fact that Hamas had been caught on camera in the previous week staging some of these searches, over the past week the bodies of 6 more hostages were located by Hamas in these areas within the yellow line and returned to Israel. Hours before I recorded this, Hamas announced that it had located another body in the Gaza Strip, that is the body of Hadar Golden. Golden is an IDF soldier who was actually killed in the Gaza Strip in 2014, and his body was held by Hamas since then. Al Jazeera published images of these excavations in the past day that reportedly took place in the Tel Sultan region of Rafah, that is this area over here, which again in theory is held by the Israeli military. However, as I said, Israeli military forces withdrew from those areas in order to allow armed Al-Qassam operatives to come into those areas and excavate for the bodies alongside the Red Cross. In total, after the return of the 6 bodies throughout the week, the bodies of 5 hostages still remain in the Gaza Strip, although again, it is possible that Hamas has already located the body of Hadar Golden. Also important to note that in exchange for the return of those 6 bodies, Israel returned the remains of 90 Palestinians, most of them to the Gaza Strip, but some of them to the West Bank, that had been held by Israel. Most of these are people who were killed during the war, but some of these prior to the war as well. In addition to this, another development in the Gaza Strip over the past week has been the negotiations over the possible safe passage for Hamas armed operatives that are held up in the areas that are controlled by the Israeli military. So, for context, since the Israeli military redeployed to the Yellow Line, and again, that means the Israeli military is now held up on a line along this area in the Gaza Strip, controlling all of these areas close to the border with Israel. Since the Israeli military's withdrawal to that area, there have been multiple incidents of Al-Qassam operatives emerging from tunnels and hiding places within those areas that are controlled by the Israeli military and attacking IDF troops, usually resulting in breakdowns of the ceasefire. At the beginning of this week, it was reported that Hamas had approached the negotiating countries and requested safe passage for between 200 to 250 armed operatives that reportedly had been holding up in tunnels in the Janina areas of Rafah, that is this area over here, as well as in the Bani Suhaila region of Han Yunis, in this area over here. In Israel, it was initially reported that the government was favorably considering this in exchange for Hamas delivering more bodies of hostages. But after internal political pressure, the Israeli government issued repeated statements that this proposal would be rejected and armed operatives would either be killed or would have to surrender. With this, I will say that despite this rhetoric, there were several reports over the past days suggesting that the matter is still being negotiated, a possible safe passage for those, again, 200 to 250 armed Palestinian operatives from the areas that are controlled by the Israeli military back to the areas that are controlled by Hamas. Among others, Axios reported on Wednesday that the Trump administration proposed that the 200 operatives would surrender and hand over their weaponry to a third party, either Egypt, Qatar, or Turkey, and then would be granted amnesty by Israel so long as they do not return to terror activity. Similarly, on Friday, it was reported that Egypt is attempting to come up with a new formula that the operatives will supply information about the tunnels that they were held up in so that they can be destroyed by Israel in exchange for safe passage to those areas that are under Hamas control. While in Israel it is publicly being denied that there is any negotiation that is taking place about safe passage for these armed operatives, I will say there's a lot of unofficial reports suggesting that these proposals are being considered. So again, we have also the return of bodies and also the negotiations over the safe passage of those operatives. A final report coming from Gaza in this past week relates to a very important development with regards to the humanitarian situation and humanitarian aid coming into the Gaza Strip. And I will say that, at least to some extent, this report has gone under the radar, but it is extremely important. Now, again, for context, when the ceasefire came into effect, Israel was required to allow upwards of 600 aid trucks come into the Gaza Strip each day. Each of these aid trucks is reportedly vetted and screened by the Israeli military forces, either at the entrance to the Gaza Strip or at the entrance to the different entry points within Israel, in order to screen for the different materials that are coming in and to make sure there's no weaponry involved. There's been a lot of reports about holdups on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side. Most of the aid trucks have managed to get in, but there are also reported delays. Amongst this, however, it is also reported over the past weeks that there is rising tension between Israel and the United States with regards to the entrance of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Specifically, Israel made several statements about limiting the amount of aid that would be coming into the Gaza Strip in response to cases of Hamas violating the agreement. However, each time the United States blocked Israel from limiting the amount of aid coming in, Israel also filed complaints with the negotiating countries about Hamas taking over some of the aid trucks that entered into the Gaza Strip, but again, this had no effect with regards to limiting the amount of aid coming in. During the past week, on Wednesday was reported that in Israel, Israeli inspectors of the aid trucks that were coming in from Jordan on their way to Israel, so there is a passage through Jordan going into Israel and then into the Gaza Strip, it was reported that the Israeli inspectors are threatening to go on strike in response to the limitations on how they carry out inspections. And Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu explicitly stated on that day during a cabinet meeting that, quote, "This causes me trouble with the Americans," end quote. Likely not in a coincidence, in the following day, Washington Post published an extensive report stating that the United States is assuming full control and responsibility for supervising the humanitarian aid that will be coming into the Gaza Strip. According to that report, the United States Center for Civilian Military Cooperation, that is the base that the United States maintains in southern Israel, is going to organize taking over all of the inspection and coordination of humanitarian aid coming into Gaza, and will effectively replace Israel as the inspector of the type, quantity, and nature of the aid coming into the Gaza Strip. In Israel, several government sources issued statements saying that this will still be done in cooperation with Israel. However, there was no denial that the country is no longer going to have the final say as to both the type of aid that comes into Gaza and the quantity of aid that comes into the Gaza Strip. In a moment of analysis, I'm going to say that beyond having potentially important implications for the entrance of aid into the Gaza Strip, this move of the United States is likely associated with the broader plans of the United States to take more responsibility for Gaza as we move into phase 2 of the deal. That's the next thing I want to talk about, but again, this is going to have substantial implications both on the aid coming into the Gaza Strip as well as on Israel's ability to say that it's going to limit that aid or condition it on Hamas carrying out certain actions. So, beyond the Gaza Strip itself, the other major development of the past week was a draft proposal that was submitted by the United States to the UN Security Council, proposing a resolution to begin implementing the next phases of Trump's 20-point plan. Again, that is the plan that we're currently embroiled in the middle of, that is supposed to bring an end to the war, and, if you follow the plan more broadly, peace to the region and possibly the entire Middle East. The entire resolution that was submitted by the United States consists of 10 articles and is 2.5 pages long. The majority of it focuses on outlining the International Board of Peace that is meant to oversee Gaza's reconstruction and be, to some extent, an overarching governing body. And the rest discusses the International Stabilization Force, that is the international military force that is meant to be made up of different militaries that will assume responsibility for the Gaza Strip, as well as other articles that focus on the humanitarian situation and several other small technical things. The entire resolution makes no mention of Hamas and instead talks about military and terror operatives in the Gaza Strip. And it only mentions Israel 3 times. This is in regards to different areas where the international bodies are required to cooperate or coordinate with Israel. The proposal opens with an endorsement of Trump's 20-point plan and notes, quote, "the historic Trump declaration for enduring peace and prosperity," end quotes. It also commends the United States, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey for their role in achieving an end to the war. It then states that, quote, "the situation in Gaza threatens the regional peace and security of neighboring states," end quote. Again, this does not mention Israel specifically, instead saying that there's a need to resolve the situation in Gaza because it threatens neighboring states and regional peace. It also notes prior UN Security Council resolutions about the Middle East and the Palestinian question. And this is also something that has to some extent gone under the radar, but noting past resolutions that relate to the Palestinian question could have implications with regards to the possibility of a future Palestinian state as well. When discussing the Board of Peace, Article 2 states that this Board of Peace will, quote, "be a transitional governance administration with international legal personality that will set the framework and coordinate funding and redevelopment of Gaza." It adds specifically that it will operate until such time as the Palestinian Authority has satisfactorily completed its reform program, the satisfaction of which shall be acceptable to the Board of Peace and to Israel, end quote. So in this sense, it says that the aim of the Board of Peace is to rebuild Gaza and essentially assume control of the Gaza Strip until it is handed over to the Palestinian Authority. And it says that the condition for this is deep reforms that will be undergone by the Palestinian Authority, which both the Board of Peace and Israel will have to accept. It's important to note, however, the resolution does not say what these reforms are that the Palestinian Authority will have to undergo, nor does it give any timetable for how long this should take. It also does not say what happens if the Board of Peace accepts the reforms of the Palestinian Authority and says they're satisfactory, but Israel does not. Again, all these things are still left vague in Article 2. Continuing to discuss the Board of Peace, which again I remind everyone is supposed to be headed by US President Trump and former United Kingdom Prime Minister Tony Blair. Article 4 outlines some of the missions of this board. According to Article 4, these include establishing a Palestinian technocratic and apolitical governing administration in the Gaza Strip, so that'll be a local governing body underneath the Board of Peace, developing economic recovery programs, coordinating humanitarian aid and assistance, and developing a mechanism for Palestinians to leave and enter the Gaza Strip. Articles 5 and 6 of the resolution discuss funding through donors, governments, and the World Bank that are all expected to donate funds to the Board of Peace and the International Stabilization Force. One of the most important facets of this resolution, which appears only in Article 7, is the establishment of that International Stabilization Force, or as it's known, the ISF. As a reminder, Trump's 20-point plan stated that the ISF would be a security mechanism that would take responsibility for areas in the Gaza Strip that the Israeli military withdraws from, but it gave no details about its actual authority or mission or who would take part in it. In this proposed resolution, Article 7 states that the Board of Peace will establish the ISF with forces contributed by participating states, which is important. It already says that the soldiers that will be sent will be those that are participating in the Board of Peace. This will be done in close consultation and cooperation with Egypt and Israel. Now, the wording there is important. In close consultation and cooperation with Egypt and Israel. This does not say that either country has a veto over who participates. It just says that they will be consulted and will cooperate with the establishment of this force. So neither Israel nor Egypt has a veto in this. The resolution states that the ISF will operate according to international law and international humanitarian law, and will work with Israel and Egypt alongside a newly established Palestinian police force that would be trained and vetted, all in order to establish security mechanisms in the Gaza Strip. Its missions, according to the resolutions, are to, quote, help secure border areas, stabilize the security environment of Gaza by ensuring the process of demilitarizing the Gaza Strip, including the destruction and prevention of rebuilding of military, terror, and offensive infrastructure, as well as the permanent decommissioning of weapons from all non-state armed groups, protecting civilians, including humanitarian operations, training and providing support to the vetted Palestinian police force, end quote. Now, looking at these various different missions, it's important to note that even in this if this resolution is accepted as is, there are still many issues that remain unclear with regards to the mission parameters of the International Stabilization Force. Among others, the resolution gives no time frame as to when the ISF will deploy in the Gaza Strip or where it will deploy in the Gaza Strip. Is it going to deploy in those areas that currently Hamas is controlling, or in the areas that the Israeli military is controlling, or in both, and when this will happen? It also doesn't say who will decide when this happens. Alongside this, it is more clear with regards to its aims as far as demilitarization and decommissioning of arms of non-state actors in the Gaza Strip, i.e. Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other Palestinian fighting organizations. However, also with regards to that demilitarization, it does not give any time frame, nor does it give an explanation as to what constitutes an offensive weapon versus a defensive weapon. And the most glaring thing that I will say is it does not say what happens if those armed groups resist demilitarization. It doesn't say, does the ISF have authority to use force or even deadly force in order to decommission weapons and demilitarize the Gaza Strip? It simply says that the ISF will do that, but that is assuming there's cooperation. What happens if those armed Palestinian operatives refuse? This resolution does not grant the ISF authority to use force, so at this point, that remains very unclear. Alongside that, while it's unclear what its role with regards to the use of force will be in demilitarizing Palestinian organizations, its authority with regards to Israel is also not clear. It says that the ISF is going to enforce safe passages of areas of humanitarian aid and protect civilians in the Gaza Strip. Unclear what that means if there is a flare-up between Israel and armed Palestinian operatives and there are civilians in the area. Technically, it's supposed to protect those civilians, so would it have authority or a requirement to engage Israel? Very unlikely the United States would put that forth. However, it's unclear with the wording right now. So again, if this is accepted as is, it brings us a step forward with regards to understanding the mission of the ISF, but it still has a lot of things that would need to be clarified in negotiations. So, summarizing the proposed resolution, like I said, it focuses primarily on the Board of Peace and may be seen as a step forward with regards to implementing the next phases of Trump's 20-point plan. However, it still leaves a lot of questions about this implementation and how it would actually look on the ground. It also is important to note that the resolution states that the Board of Peace and the ISF will be authorized to operate until the end of 2027, so it's giving it quite a long time in order to actually get on the ground and put into effect all of these operations. However, it's also quite clear that it will take more than 2 years to fulfill all of these missions in the Gaza Strip. The resolution says that any reauthorization of the ISF will have to be in full cooperation and coordination with Egypt and Israel. Again, though, it does not say what happens if one side agrees, one side does not. Can Israel veto this and say it does not want the ISF to continue because it may not be doing its job demilitarizing? Can Egypt veto this because it does not like that it is not carrying out its mission satisfactorily? Israel has also explicitly stated that it does not want troops from Turkey to take part in the ISF. However, the resolution says that the participating states in the Board of Peace will send troops to the ISF, which includes Turkey. All of these questions still remain to be negotiated. So again, this is a step forward with regards to understanding the implementation, but still, there are a lot of further steps that would need to be taken in order to see how this actually develops on the ground. Before I conclude, I'm going to add one brief note and say that while it has not been the main focus of the war in the past year, the arena between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon has been steadily escalating over the past weeks, with some major events happening in the last few days. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I will say that the optimism that was seen with expectations of the Lebanese government and the military deploying to possibly disarm Hezbollah, which has been happening over the past year, has been replaced with serious pessimism over the past week, with the Lebanese government making announcements that it cannot disarm Hezbollah by force, as this would cause a civil war. So, to some extent, it might be said that the Lebanese military and Hezbollah have been playing a game of chicken over the past year as to who is going to blink first, who is going to be willing to risk an escalation between the sides in the civil war, and the Lebanese government has now at least publicly stated they're not going to move to disarm Hezbollah by force because this would risk a civil war, so they are, to some extent, the ones that blinked first. Amidst these announcements, Israel has been steadily increasing its attacks in Lebanon, which are now happening multiple times a day. These have included major airstrikes in southern Lebanon and sometimes even further into northern Lebanon, and also 2 ground incursions into new areas in southern Lebanon that have happened over the past 2 weeks. The rhetoric between Israel and Hezbollah has also been steadily escalating, with Israel stated that if need be, it will launch a full campaign to disarm Hezbollah itself, and the group stating that it is preparing its weaponry to engage an Israeli invasion of Lebanon and to defend Lebanon from any further Israeli invasions. On Thursday, Israel issued evacuation orders to several different areas in southern Lebanon before massive airstrikes were reported, leading to major panic within the Lebanese population and a major evacuation of civilians towards the northern areas. Now, again, at this point, the negotiations are still ongoing, and a lot of countries are attempting to possibly resolve the escalations. There are proposed resolutions in the United States as well as by Egypt. But it would not be a surprise that as the arena in Gaza dies down, this arena possibly may flare up again, so it is likely something that should be paid attention to in the coming weeks. Before concluding this video, I'll again say check out the link in the first comment if you want to sign up for the newsletter that I am setting up. That is meant primarily to update people on when I'm going to have live stream Q&As and anything else that people might want to ask about. Feel free to sign up. The link appears in that first comment. That concludes my latest highlight in the Israel-Palestine Report. If you find these reports interesting, please do remember to send them on to anyone you think might be interested in what's going on in this region of the world. Hit that like button, subscribe, turn on notifications so you know when these reports come out. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'm Alon Burstein. I'm a professor of political science and an Israel Institute fellow at Tufts University. Thanks for watching.